So Jill Jamieson, she's the CEO of Illuminati Infrastructure, and we're going to talk about tapping finance to modernize Jackson Hole's water resources. And really, I'm pretty thrilled to have Jill here. She's a globally recognized leader in infrastructure finance. Jill advises a wide range of federal, state, and local public authorities across the U.S. as well as the globe. In between all this, Jill actually runs many marathons. In fact, this year in January, she did the World Marathon. So she did 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 continents. Yeah. And just because she's getting a little bit bored, I think she's going to try and swim from Chile to Antarctica soon. So, yeah. She's a dynamo, and I think you're going to hear that she is. So please welcome Jill Jamieson.
Well, thank you so much. I am persistent, if nothing else. I guess that's how people, or stubborn is the other way they describe me. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time in Jackson Hole, and I am, like many people, I've fallen in love with it over the course of 2 days, even with the weather that you've given us, so I thank you. And thanks to everyone who's given me a jacket today. I had like 14 jackets on me at one point. I am going to wear this coat as I speak. It's not because I need to run for the exit. It's just simply because it's a little bit chilly. And this is not a hand grenade. This is a hand warmer, so we will take it from there. It says that I'm going to talk about financing, but I'm not going to talk about only financing. Financing and money is important, but as you move, and with the water quality master plan coming to fruition in the near future, it's going to be socialized. You're going to get some recommendations. So many projects with great intentions end up sitting on shelves for long periods of time. There are a lot of planners out there who are frustrated, angry, et cetera. I heard somebody ask today, earlier this morning, you know, these are important issues. Why isn't the government doing more? Like, well, what is paralyzing them? That's what I do, is I catalyze governments to act because it is so frustrating. It's sometimes about the money, sometimes about competing priorities. But as I'll tell you in a second, you know, nearly 70% of public agencies are not organized to deliver the infrastructure that they need to deliver today. Just in grand scheme of things, think about climate change or coastal resilience, which is not an issue here, but sea levels are rising. We need to put in a whole series of new infrastructure up and down the coast. There's no organization for that within the government. There's no government agency for flood walls, for raising our bridges, for transportation systems, for utilities, for aquifer protection, et cetera. So what we have is this institutional confusion that is resulting in paralysis of a lot of these projects. Sometimes it's money and there's just not enough of it, so they break projects into tiny bits and pieces and do one little thing, but you don't deliver the public benefits till you finish the full project. I'm working on a project with the Corps of Engineers that began in 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, and it's still not done today. And at current funding levels from Congress, it looks like it'll be done in another 25, 30 years, which means 100 years to build an infrastructure project. This is an irrigation project. It's pretty much a ditch and a pump station. And it's taken the great United States of America 100 years to build it. So what do we need to do is we need to think a little bit more clearly about how do we go from planning to execution. You can't wait 100 years to resolve this nitrate problem that you have. You cannot wait 100 years. Your water system, your watershed, everything about this community will be destroyed. Somebody else asked, what do we do about rates and charges? And I will talk about that in a minute. But keep in mind there's a cost to doing nothing as well. The cost of doing nothing is that in some point in 10, 15 years, you need to make $1 billion investment on an emergency basis, which is never when it's cheapest. That's when it's the most expensive, and that's going to cost you more money. I'll throw out a fact that I'm going to talk about in another minute. Deferred maintenance on a lot of our infrastructure. For every dollar of deferred maintenance, that converts into $6 that we need to invest in that same asset. So when you don't make a timely investment in your infrastructure to maintain it and operate it, 6 times more you're going to have to invest in the future. If we look at your problem today and we say, well, what happens if we just push this off another 10 years? It's going to be more than 6 because with inflationary pressures, et cetera, your investment needs are going to continue to grow. So whatever they end up being, think about it as what is the cost of us doing nothing. You need to act, you need to future-proof, you need to do all these things, but delaying should not ever be an option. Yes, you need to make the right decisions, and that's not my area. I make very bad decisions for myself, which is why I'm swimming from Chile to Antarctica. But leaving that aside, you do want to make the decisions about what are my goals, what are my objectives, what is the outcome that we're after, and then think about, as you're thinking about how to define those objectives, how am I going to make this a reality? And that's everything. Do you have the institutional capacity? So here you have a whole host of issues, whether it's a wastewater treatment plant, whether it is onlining the septic systems to the sewer or actually putting in localized treatment. These are diversity. Is any institution within the government of Jackson Hole well aligned to handle that? Have they ever done that before? Would they need to hire a bunch of new people? Should you outsource this? You ask these. Am I moving? Sorry. There's a ghost in the machine. Okay, so those are the questions you need to ask. How is it going to be funded is clearly an important question. I'll be honest with you, funding and financing in my world is not the hardest question. It is never the hardest question. You can figure that out, but how do you get that money, even if you issue muni bonds? How do you get the money into the ground and working in a timely and efficient manner? So many of our infrastructure projects in America do not get done in a timely manner. We piecemeal things, we have extra costs for mobilization, demobilization, et cetera. So how do you want to deliver these projects? Should you do it as a programmatic approach and have everything bundled into a single project that's funded, financed, pay upon completion? Do you pay as you go? These are the issues that you're going to have to think about. How do you mitigate the impact of this on rates and charges? That question should never be minimized, even in a wealthy community. There are going to be people that simply cannot afford or don't want to afford this. Most of us don't know what our infrastructure is. Last night, somebody was talking about levees. We have 100,000 miles of levees in the United States. We only know where 30% of those are. They've been built and we forgot them. This is a true fact. The Corps of Engineers is trying to do an inventory of levees. They're digging, they're like, is that a levee or a hill? Nobody knows, right? We as Americans are so lucky that we drive down the highway. We don't know that there's a levee next to it, that there's a flood ditch next to it. We take things at face value. So we often don't know what we have, and we don't know why we're paying for it. And you have to be educated in that regard. But there are ways to structure and sculpt rates so that those who are currently paying a sort of a lower rate, that's their tradition, can continue to do so, maybe with some moderate increase, and that new people who are online onto the system would then pay more. So there are different ways to sculpt these things. You also put the financing into that and say, well, why don't we amortize these costs over 100 years as opposed to over 10 years, mitigating the impact. And that's what we do on a daily basis. So there are ways to work through that, but you're asking the right questions with those, and it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. There are also smart subsidies for people that can't afford certain things. So there are many mechanisms and tools out there. I often ask the question, as a taxpayer, is this infrastructure project being delivered in the timeliest and most cost-effective manner? The answer is almost always no, right? As I mentioned, the 100-year project is just, it's mind-boggling. In the 1930s, when the United States was under the New Deal, we started building highway systems and doing all kinds of great things. It was a jobs program. It was really to create employment opportunities for people after the Depression. We are not in that situation today. We have workforce shortages in the construction and the infrastructure business. As such, we can't afford to allow these projects to drag on and on. I know there's some political differences about that. If you go to Washington, there's a big talking point about infrastructure being a job creation plan, but right now we don't need job creation because we're literally no unemployment. So we have to figure out how can we deliver the infrastructure in a timely and cost-effective manner. But we also have to go beyond thinking just about how much does this cost to build. you have to think about the life cycle of the asset. And that is, how much does it cost to operate and maintain it? How much energy am I consuming? What is my footprint? What are the major maintenance and repairs? Most assets will have, depending on the sort of the asset class. If you're a highway, you might have a 80-year life cycle asset. If you're a water system, maybe it's 45 or 50 years. So you know when you're building it, basically how long that asset is going to last. But what we don't do is budget for that or plan for that or even think about the rate impacts of that. And as a nation, our national hobby, although you might think it's baseball, is deferred maintenance. We're really good at it. It's just not as sexy to go to a deferred maintenance game, right? Because nobody really does that. But deferred maintenance, so again, for every dollar of deferred maintenance, that's $6 in future costs. But we do this all the time. Why? Because we have limited budgets. So we say, well, instead of fixing that small hole in the tent, I'm just going to put a bucket underneath. There's not a small hole. Everyone looked up like, oh, no. You put a bucket underneath it, and I'll get to it next year, because right now I need to fix that hole in the ground over there. So with limited budgets, plus what we're doing is we're deferring maintenance, which then become bigger problems. This is capturing all of our infrastructure money. It's major maintenance and repair, deferred maintenance, et cetera. Nobody likes that stuff. Like you don't have a ribbon cutting ceremony when you're fixing a hole in the roof. You will when you're building something new. So people are like, let's build something new, and they will, and then they'll let it go immediately into disrepair. So as you guys are thinking about your water quality master plan, and you're thinking about, okay, how much is it going to cost to do that? Think also about how are we going to, on a sustainable level, maintain and operate this so that it doesn't fall into disrepair and that it's working, it's future-proofed, it can be upgraded with new technologies as we go as well. So something to think about. And then finally, is the appropriate legal, regulatory, and institutional framework available for this? What sort of laws? I mean, we heard this morning a lot about, incentive programs, carrots and sticks and those sorts of things. That also needs to be part of this. But even economic regulation of rates and charges, that's going to be a big issue going forward as well. So there are a lot of issues there that would also need to be considered, including and not limited to who's in charge of these projects. You've got a county and you've got a town, and is there a need for regionalization, perhaps, of the water authority, which is sort of the trend right now in the United States. But again, these are the things that paralyze people, right? And this is paralyzing a lot of our infrastructure. It is not uncommon for planning documents to sit on shelves for 10 to 15 years. It's sad, but it's not uncommon. And what happens is once they're dusted off, we find that they're no longer relevant, so we go back to ground zero, right? And we start again. Some projects that are being built today basically are for horse and buggies, and we're well beyond that in terms of our transportation system. So you have to think in terms of that holistic approach. But implementation, thinking about it, your strategy needs to start now. It's not an afterthought. It's not, okay, well, once we figure that out, then we'll figure out how to do it. Because even the color of money will change and influence what are your delivery options and those sorts of things. There's money available if it's run by a municipality that may not be available if it's run by a private operator. Do you want to access those money? Things like private activity bonds and those sorts of things we can talk about. So from planning to execution is the big issue. I'm going to talk about three basic topics, though. The first one is funding and financing, which is what it said I was going to talk about, so I threw that in there anyway. So I will talk about that a little bit. Again, there's a difference between funding and financing. Financing is how you get a loan and structure your money so that you can use it now and pay it off in the future. Funding is how are you paying for it, right? Granted, grants and those sorts of things are really great, and if you can get them, it buys down the total cost, but most infrastructure projects involve some level of financing at some point, and that needs to be paid off over time. That's what's going to influence the rates and charges going forward. The more free money you can get up front, the less that's going to impact rates and charges, but there's always going to be a rates and charges impact because of operations, maintenance, and those sorts of things. So the question of money, before I get into sort of what's out there, what's available, et cetera, I like to scare people, especially when they're eating, about the U.S. infrastructure imperative. We've heard that, we're at unprecedented levels of funding from the federal level for infrastructure, et cetera. But I want to give you a kick in the gut in terms of the reality. The United States needs approximately $15 trillion in the next 15 years or so, just of investment in our infrastructure, just to keep pace with GDP. In other words, if we don't make that level of investment, our standard of living will decline. And this is a massive number, especially when you take into account that we just got $1 trillion infrastructure package that's been heralded as the world's greatest thing. That's over 5 years, $1 trillion over 5 years, when we need 15 over 15 years, right? We are nowhere close to what we need in terms of our investment requirements. And if we look at our sort of state of infrastructure, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and this is not science, this is an art, and they're a lobbyist group, and they have interest in showing us these sorts of things. But they, every 4 years, come out with their infrastructure report card, and they're giving the United States a C-. If any of your kids came back from school with C-minuses on their report card, you'd have a talk with them, right? This is a slight increase from 4 years ago when we were at D+. So I guess the education system is working well for our infrastructure. But I quibble often with them publicly because where they're giving better ratings, I'm not. It's promises from Washington that haven't materialized, and I don't think you give people that better rating for that. But even if we take them at their word at a C-, you can see some things like stormwater is at a D. We've got wastewater at a D+. We've got our levees and our dam. Well, dams are okay, but dams are actually also out of favor right now. So the fact that they're doing well is a little bit odd. We have levees at a D. So in the water sector and water resources sector, we're really below the curve, and that's to be expected. Transportation sucks all the air out of the room when you're talking about infrastructure, and water is always considered an afterthought. So anyway, this gives you sort of a horrible view of reality in America. I would say it's worse, though, than this. First of all, we've had a fix-as-fails approach to infrastructure for decades. Fix-as-fails means what it says. We only fix things when there's a catastrophic problem. I sit in meetings often at the federal level with entities that say, look, Cape Cod, Ashley was talking today about Cape Cod and their issues. They have 2 bridges that were built in 1929, the Bourne and the Sagamore. They're well past their useful life cycle. They're being held together with spit and glue. And the Corps of Engineers somehow owns them because when they built them, there wasn't a national highway or a federal highway program. So it's on the books of the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers has a $6 billion a year budget for everything that it does. This is like a $2 billion project. They're never going to be able to fund this. So they're saying, Massachusetts, you should do this. It costs twice as much to try to keep these things operational than to just go ahead and build a new project. But right now it looks like nobody wants to foot the bill, so we're delaying this, spending billions of dollars holding those bridges up, despite the fact that we all know that we need new bridges. And so this is the paralysis we see every day when it comes to infrastructure. It's sad, but it is the reality. Likewise, I say that money is generally the least of my problems in what I do in advising public sector entities in terms of infrastructure. We have a $4 trillion municipal bond market in the United States. It's anybody, like I can create a company and issue my own, or a non-for-profit and issue my own bonds. It seems like somebody will buy them. What the rate is might be a different story. But financing is usually not the issue. It's really how do we structure the payments and who's paying the nut back, right? So how are we doing this in a way that's affordable? I'm going to give you another stark, horrible data point. Michigan State University about 4 years ago did a study about the cost of just getting the lead out of our drinking water across the nation. And I think the number was something like 7 trillion. It was like some horrifically large number because it's replacing a lot of pipes. There's a lot that needs to go into that in terms of construction, engineering, et cetera. So $7 trillion. If we pass that through to rates and charges to users, 40% of American households would not be able to afford their water bills. 40%. And that's just for lead. When we start talking nitrates and everything else, these numbers go up, right? And so there is this moment of paralysis. Well, maybe we shouldn't do this now because nobody can afford it. Let's wait for the federal government to give us money. Look, they just did the largest infrastructure package I think we're ever going to see in our lifetime. As I told you, it's woefully inadequate for what we need. So we need to think more creatively, and not only in terms of where to get the money, but how to deploy it more efficiently. Because Mostly once you get the money, you're like, my problem's over. You've got a contractor who's coming back time and time again for more and more and more, and the thing is getting delayed for whatever reason. So we need to deliver infrastructure more in a timely or more cost-effective manner. I mentioned the wastewater sector, just because it is relevant to you guys. We're sitting at a national average of D+, which is, just above failure as a nation, right? So every single system has troubles. But one of the issues that we have is that most of our wastewater treatment facilities were built in about the mid-'60s. There was a boom of infrastructure spending, and they are now at the absolute end of their useful life cycle. They've been, again, held together with spit and glue, some gum maybe here on the side, but these things are no longer working in the way, and so we're spending so much money every day to keep them operational, which is why rates and charges are going up, but the infrastructure quality isn't getting any better. On top of that, these are mostly horrifically inefficient systems, especially in light of new technology. So not your system. I mean, well, I'm not going to talk about your system, the pond system, but like if you look in downtown Detroit, you look at the rivers and Lake Michigan, what do you see? You see 16 to 20 acres of the biggest, ugliest wastewater treatment plant sitting right on your waterways. And why? Because they need the proximity to outfalls and those sorts of things. Now with new technologies, you can take that 16 acres, you can reduce it to 2. You can bury the whole thing underground, and people are reclaiming that land, and they're using it for whether it's affordable housing, urban development, other things. So people are saying, look, I'm not going to rebuild as it was. I'm going to build back better and build back smarter, right? By smarter, I mean with new technologies. There is so much happening on the technology area in terms of smart infrastructure. In 5 years, any pipe should have smart sleuth, it's called Pipe Sleuth, which basically will tell you if your pipe is leaking anywhere so that you can immediately repair it and so you don't have water losses. We have in the United States something like 30% of our water is lost just to seepage. And these are things that can be resolved very quickly. But as I said, wastewater treatment plants, they're at the end of their useful life cycle. Consent decrees are another big issue. So EPA basically saying your system is not doing what it's supposed to do. I know here you've got sort of a loosier-goosier regulatory sort of framework for those sorts of things. But you as a local community may not want to live by that loosey-goosey area, and you might want to bring it up to a standard that exceeds and protects in accordance with your values. There's also a need for more resilient infrastructure. A lot of our infrastructure was built before sea level rises, before water rises, drought, climate change, all these things. We need to future-proof these things, as we were talking about earlier. This is an entire area where people are paralyzed in terms of what do we do, how do we do it, et cetera. Reuse opportunities is another big one. So wastewater used to be something we just threw into a river, after it was treated, of course, hopefully. But reuse now. So basically, people are paying top dollar in California to get your wastewater. And what they're doing is purifying it and either putting it back into the aquifers for indirect potable reuse. Shortly, we expect the regulations for direct potable reuse. So it's essentially speeding up nature's process of purifying water. There's no such thing as pure water. It's all been through the system a few times. And basically with membranes and other sorts of things are speeding this up. I'm working on a project in Silicon Valley right now where the cost of indirect potable reuse, so water that's just being shot back into the ground, could reach $16,000 an acre foot, but it is so important that they're willing to pay that. And they had to negotiate a deal with Palo Alto and Santa Clara to get access to that wastewater. There was a bidding war for that wastewater, and I'm like, who's buying wastewater? But this is something that you may want to consider. As you design a new plant, are you in the future going to want to use that wastewater for reuse, whether it's for purple pipe and you just are irrigating something, or potentially even for indirect potable reuse or for direct potable reuse once the regs are there. So water is increasing in value, and its treatment will also increase in value. But there's been a lot of laws, not only bipartisan infrastructure law, ARPA, Inflation Reduction Act. They're all there, and they're all adding to sort of this amount of money that's coming in. This is an important graphic in terms of what the federal government does. So over the last 50 years or 40 years, federal funding has pretty much stayed steady. This one is cut off a little bit early, just in the graphic. We do have a little bit of an uptick at the bottom line in terms of federal funding through this recent infrastructure bill. But you'll see that the growing amount of infrastructure is paid for locally, right? So the idea, there was so much talk that Washington is going to foot the bill for a lot of stuff. They're not. They pay, depending on who you talk to, maximum of 35% of total infrastructure, and most of that is in transportation and particularly aviation. For water, it's usually less than 10% of the total cost of projects are being funded through federal funding. So think about that. It is a local financing solution. Yes, you want to access any of the free money that's out there, but at the same sense, it's not going to be, let's call it a panacea or a get-out-of-jail-free card. There's not going to be this beautiful grant that's going to cover all of your needs for the next 50 years. That's just not how the way federal financing works for infrastructure. And most of this money over the past years has been for repair. It has not been, operations are 100% local. They're very rarely taken at federal level. New capital projects, yes, but most of it has been dependent on repairing. Now replacement is becoming the issue, particularly with projects like yours that involve modernizing infrastructure. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as you guys know, was approved November 15th, 2021. It's about a billion, total of $1 trillion. Sorry, there's a 973 billion, which is close to $1 trillion, over 5 years, but only 550 billion new dollars. Right, so this was everything else. So this is $500 million over 5 years. It's $100 million a year. Forget my math. Oh, sorry, jet lag. So it's not much, and it's spread across multiple jurisdictions, right? And so transportation, airports. We now have new things like electric vehicles, et cetera, and charging stations. So the amount of money, woefully, that went into water is pathetically small. It's only 10% of the total spend is for water, and a lot of that is for drinking water. So it was not a windfall for the water sector. It is the largest investment by the federal government in water in the U.S. history, but it's still, again, every other sector gets all the attention and we get none of the money, right? But it is an important thing. There are a lot of programs available. The Clean Water component of this, Clean Water Act component of this, had $55 billion in it. Basically, 23.4 goes to the state revolving funds that were talked about today. Wyoming has one of the smallest in the nation in terms of state revolving funds. I think it gets $5.6 million a year from Washington, and then that's an 80-20 split. So there's not a lot of money there. You've got some other sorts of things, water and sewer tax support, which is actually to subsidize people who can't afford some of the improvements to the water and sewer at $1.25 billion, and rural water, $1 billion. And you guys do qualify in many instances for the rural grants programs. And I think that everyone looks to EPA, but also, I'll talk about this now, but there's a lot of money as well available through USDA, even HUD, that you might not think about. But USDA is the second largest lender in the United States after U.S. Treasury, which is issuing all of our bonds, right? They have more money often than God, and they have programs that you may not have even thought about. I think Ashley mentioned a couple that they had access. There's a bunch out there for planning, engineering. If you use some of the models that I'll talk about for delivery, like Progressive, they could probably help fund some of that for you. So there are some interesting models out there. But Western Water also did get some money. Again, $8.3 billion. A lot of that is dedicated for drought contingencies, recycled water, et cetera. But there is a lot of money there. The challenge is, how do you go about pursuing it? I would say that 80% of the money is now, probably 90% is now available. We're still in rulemaking on a couple of these programs, including some of the Bureau of Reclamation's programs, particularly for water treatment, but it's mostly recycled. So the money is out there and available, but how you access this, it should be part of your delivery program. Don't wait for it. Do not wait for it. I every day see this. People will paralyze their project waiting for the grant money. You can use that grant money if you get it in 2 years or 3 years. Go for it now, don't get me wrong. But do not delay your infrastructure needs in the hope of free money in the future. It does not work out well for anybody involved. plan for how you're going to start this thing and do it. Use grant money as a supplement, as something to buy down the cost, but know what that cost is up front. Honestly, it's one of my pet peeves. We've seen major projects paralyzed as lobbyists get billions of dollars to go to Washington to fight for a $200 million grant. At the end of the day, that grant may not materialize or may materialize in a $50 billion look, but the community has spent $25 other million just trying to get that money, right? So there's a cost to it. It's free money, but it comes at a cost if you delay your project, because inflation alone, we're looking still at 12% inflationary rates on construction, despite the decrease in sort of cost of living. So if you push off a project a year, just expect it to go up another 12%, right? So if you push it up 5 years, you're looking at a 60% increase potentially in your cost of the project. It can double very quickly. So don't wait on grant money. Put together a financing plan up front. And the federal funding basically comes in different sort of packages, right? You have your formula grants, which are the apportion. That's where you get your Clean Water Revolving Fund money, right? Your SRF money, as we call it, State Revolving Fund. Every state is apportioned a certain amount. There's a cost share. It can be a loan or loan forgiveness. But it is a loan. It's not free money, as I was talking just a second ago. Then you have discretionary competitive grant, where you write your grant application, you go for money. Bureau of Reclamation has some really interesting things for water treatment. I think USDA, particularly for your septic issues, there is a lot of money, and there are programs that could actually be crafted around your needs with a pilot project and some other sorts of things. So I see a lot of potential there as well. Whether those two projects, the treatment center and the septic issues, are combined or separated, that's a question that needs to be sort of, I think, looked at more closely. But also, depending on how you deliver it, if you brought in like a private operator to do this, because again, it's multi-jurisdictional, whether you own it or whether they own it or whatever you want to do, there's a thing called private activity bonds, which basically allows a third party to borrow at municipal rates or tax-exempt rates, and they can finance it at a low cost. But that only works if you're using sort of a private delivery model as opposed to a public delivery model. So you have to start to integrate the model with the financing with everything else. There are also, federal credit programs. Everyone's heard of the WIFIA program, which is basically a 30-year loan, up to 35-year repayment. You can sculpt completely the amortization, so you can pay it all back in 35 years, the principal, as a bullet payment. It's U.S. Treasury rates, which is basically the lowest you can get, except for SRF, which right now is 2%, 20 years, often with debt forgiveness on the backside. So there's just a lot out there. Part of what you need to do between now and when you get to your recommendations is kind of figure out how we're going to group these projects together and what would be our funding and financing plan for this, and then look for those sorts of things. This is a reality of the SRFs. So if you can see that, which I can barely see it, since 1989 to 2026, which is reflective of all of the infrastructure bill money, that graphic on the right shows federal funding for SRF, state revolving funds, clean water, et cetera. It's higher than it has been, but it's not materially higher. And again, Wyoming is on the absolute lowest rung of what it gets through this money because of population, right? It just doesn't have the same numbers. Population is part of the formula approach that they have. So this is a really important thing to consider. The federal money may not be as easily accessible through SRFs and other sorts of things. You may need to go to Washington. I did just get educated about there being other funds at the state level. Can you remind me of what that was called? The SBIL? SLIB. I'm dyslexic all of a sudden. So SLIB. I was SPIL or SLIB. So that basically are grant monies that will be, put it up at the state level. There's politics involved in that, I'm sure, but that's free money as well. So just taking a look at all of that, getting together your financing and funding plan, but this is something that needs to be done now, and not only about how we're going to implement the project, but also the life cycle. And this is where the question earlier about rates and charges comes in. Even if you could get 100% donations for the major infrastructure components, what's it going to cost to operate and maintain this over the years, and what's the impact? Theoretically, you should be able to lower your costs. I don't know if you're at cost recovery right now, but theoretically you should be able to lower costs because you're going to be more energy efficient, you're going to have newer infrastructure, less on maintenance, et cetera. But even if you do that, are you at full cost recovery right now? These are the questions that needs to be looked at very closely. That's probably an aspect that I don't know if Powell JC is going to do that or somebody else, but it needs to be looked at in terms of your financial planning for this for sure. Financing considerations as well. Do you want to go off balance sheet? If would this town want to take this on? Obviously, as it's a publicly operated wastewater treatment plant now, would they be able to issue bonds for that, or would there be benefit in going off balance sheet and using a private third party to actually be the conduit or the issuer of those bonds? Do you want deferred draws? There's all kinds of financial structures there that need to be thought about. Sustainability of the sources as well is really important. So again, this goes back to the rates and charges issue. What does that look like going forward? Are there mechanisms? And somebody asked earlier today, I think, about developer transfer fees or real estate transfer fees, et cetera. We're seeing that in Boston right now, but just called something different. But as new people come onto your system, they should not necessarily pay the same as those who have sort of grandfathered their way in, right? So you can have a bifurcated rate-making system so that those who are coming to the system will help compensate what the others have already paid for in the past, right? So your I&I, so your infiltration and inflow, those sorts of things, that's your sewer system, is going to have to look at sort of what is the sunk cost. There's a lot of financial analysis that goes into that. But also look at value capture opportunities. As I said, can you sell that water to a group? Your treated wastewater, instead of just throwing it right back into the river, can you actually sell that to somebody to irrigate their lands? And then you're actually doing indirect potable reuse or indirect reuse, because then it filters through the ground, gets cleansed, et cetera. Mitigation credits as well. If you're using, if you're reclaiming land and you're purifying some land, can you use and sell those mitigation credits? Is there value capture in terms of any land that's gained by using a smaller footprint? All of these things need to be looked at, but that's how you put together your funding and financing plan, right? It's not, it sounds complicated, and most of you are probably like, why am I here? I'm so tired, you just ate, you're getting bored. But these are sort of the things that you need to think about that go beyond the science, right? This is the practical stuff, and it should align your kind of decision making at the same time you're finalizing your master plan so that you have a plan for moving forward. And I'd also say that financing and funding are not just constructs for getting something done. They will also greatly influence, or can greatly influence, how quickly that infrastructure gets built. So the use of at-risk private capital, for instance, bonding, structure, equity investments, that they can lose if they don't deliver this infrastructure in a timely manner is really important in holding your contractors to account. They're willing to do it, don't get me wrong, but make them put skin in the game. Make the outputs part of their economic package, and you will see a completely different behavior in your contractors, and that's how we get things done more quickly. But that leads to this next question. So the funding and financing needs to be designed, structured, sculpted, taking into account affordability and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of money out there. It's kind of figuring out, as you break down the project, are we looking at one big project, smaller projects? That's going to dictate how you're going to put together your financing plan. Second, and probably more importantly, is how am I going to deliver it? And I mentioned this a couple of times, but at dinner the other night, this is like, I should have this as a tattoo on my forearm because I talk about this so much. It's got to be. But 9 out of 10 of the world's mega projects, which are like $100 million plus projects, overrun their budget, are delayed, so they're beyond schedule, and they don't deliver the expected benefit. So basically what that means is that when the public sector makes an investment decision, whether they call it this or not, they do a cost-benefit analysis. Is it worth it for the public that we spend the public money on this project? We can talk all about methodologies, et cetera, but they have to assume a completion date on that, and then they take the net present value of those benefits and the net present value of the cost, and they compare it. Well, that's fine and well if that project is done in 4 or 5 years, which is what they assumed in their modeling. But when it takes 25 to 30 years, the benefits have completely depleted, right? And this goes back to the story I told you at the beginning about the Eisenhower administration project. For that project to be completed, it needs to be 100% completed. There are no partial benefits. The irrigation system doesn't work until the ditch is finished and the pump station is working. The state has spent hundreds of millions of dollars of interest payments on bonds it issued in the 1950s and reissued and reissued and reissued. So it's spending more money. Costs, obviously, since the 50s have raised just a tad. So the project that was originally, I think, a $100 million project is now like a $5 billion project. And on top of that, the benefits that they had calculated now are discounted back to almost zero. In fact, they don't really need the project anymore. There's just so much inertia that they're like, we're going to finish this thing if it kills me, right? So this is an important thing because I just don't know, after even talking with many of you over the last couple of days, who is going to be in charge of this project? Who's going to issue the procurement documents? It's boring as hell to talk about, I get it. But this is the practical matter. Who is going to be the contracting authority for getting these things done, right? Is it the city? Is it the town? Is it the county? Does it need to be a new entity? I don't think it can be PAL JH as a nonprofit, right? These are public works projects. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to procure this? Is it million procurements? Is it design bid build? Is it design build? All kinds of these issues need to be thought about. So this is the problem that we have, and there is a host of options. This is the world that I work in. So you can start at sort of the traditional, which is probably what you're seeing on that road that I drive every day where there's traffic jams, right? So design, bid, build. You procure a designer who does the architectural engineering design. Then you take those designs, approve them, then you go to a second procurement, which takes 8 to 10 months, by the way, to do these procurements. And then you bring on a contractor who then will implement that work. Now, if there's any confusion on the designs, there can be counterclaims and claims, or you might need to go back to the designer and they need to update these things. It's just, there's no ownership of the design once you've delivered it, and the construction company had no input into the design, so it's forced to. It's very inefficient, but that's our traditional delivery. Moreover, once that road is constructed, nobody's ever talked to the operating folks and the maintenance folks about what needs to happen, and they have a completely different bucket. So design, bid, build is like a very inefficient, but it's the way most of our work gets done. We've evolved. You can do design, build now. You bring in a single entity. That's a little bit more efficient, but then again, on the operating side, particularly when you're talking water systems, they're not involved, so the efficiency of the operations get a little bit lost in the discussion of design and construction. And we can go all the way through that. And so that's sort of the left green box over there. On the right side is complete privatization, right? So you hire American Water and they would come in and maybe you sell your existing facility to them, you can get money for it, and then they're going to operate it, maintain it. You take on the role of a regulator. We did it with telecom in the 80s, right? I mean, AT&T was literally a state-owned company, and then it became private. So it's not without precedent, it's just not that common. Then the infrastructure facilities are actually privately owned, and there's some issues with that. And then you have this middle section, which is that blue section, which generally refers to public-private partnerships. And in that sense, it's not one thing, and everybody thinks it means something different. It is a swath, a broad spectrum of contracting structures, everything from mere performance-based contracts to like really complex things that we call like design, build, finance, operate, maintain. So you would issue one procurement document, a party would come in, they would design, construct, they would finance this for 30, 50 years, however long, they would operate and maintain it at prescribed levels, right? It's kind of like, I want to own it because it's a public utility or a public asset, but I just don't want to do it. And we see that often with desalination. No public entity had experience in the United States with desal a couple of years ago, right? So what happens? We bring in companies, whether they're from, Israel or the Netherlands, very good at desal, and they would design, build, they take all the risk associated with delivery. So there's a swath of these things, which is also something you need to think about, right? Again, it's not only how are we paying for it, how are we delivering it? If the town of Jackson, who may not be completely bought into the idea of a new wastewater treatment facility, were to be in charge of a procurement, are you confident that their procurement would be successful, right? Or do you think, because we see it all the time where you get failed procurements because the entity doing the procurement isn't really that into the idea to begin with, right? Can you put your own values into those procurement documents as well? Values like limiting greenhouse emissions. Right now, we've got literally triple net zero wastewater treatment plants being constructed. I never knew it was possible, but with the use of solar, with the use of anaerobic membranes, and I'm not technical, so I have no idea what any of these words means that I'm saying. But literally, they've been able to reclaim a lot of the environmental benefits of the natural processes. So it's been pretty amazing. But this is something to think about. Generally, how you think about this is you do an analysis of here's like different options. Which ones gives us the best value for money? Which one is best aligned with our objectives and values? There's no right answer. There may be some wrong answers, but there are no right answers. You choose this depending on where you want to take this, what your objectives might be, et cetera. But there are a lot of contracting options out there that I think, particularly for what you guys are doing, is going to be interesting. And this is just to show you a look at what it would, a P3 would look like, sort of in a very traditional state. Again, there's not one size fits all. You can go tax-exempt structures, taxable structures, not-for-profit structures, et cetera. But basically, the public entity will be contracting with a single entity. It's a special purpose vehicle. It's created, combined with designers, construction company, operators, maintenance folks. They do the equity, they do the financing, they put the package together. All you need to do is you start paying them back for their investment once the plant is operational and operating at prescribed value. So you're not paying up front for something that may not work, et cetera. But I think it's an interesting model, particularly for what you're doing and the size and complexity of some of these projects. That said, I do want to just parenthesize myself and say that in talking with some of you, about the septic issues, and we were just having some sidebar conversations. There's another model out there that I didn't put a slide on, but I probably should have, that was evolved from stormwater management. So a lot of consent decrees came up on cities, and they were told that they need to put permeable pavements in and whatnot. Again, there was no one entity that was really well positioned to do this. So everyone's like, how are we going to do this? So basically, cities would hire a single contractor who would finance and design and operate and deliver these things. They would only get paid when they would meet the requirements of the consent decree. So let's say they had to put in 10 different parks as well as permeable pavement. They would do that in one geographic area, and then they would start to get paid for that work. But they would do the design work, they would do the public outreach with the local communities, et cetera. It allowed the city to basically say, we're just going to monitor performance. We're not going to do this ourselves, because it was very complicated. They would have had to staff like 200 new people within the government organization. So they decided not to. So there are some models, and I think particularly for some of the septic issues that might work, as well as a model called progressive contracting. I'm doing like 20 of them right now. It is the model that came to life, and it was born years ago, but it's really picked up steam since COVID. And essentially what it is it can be a progressive P3 or a progressive design build or progressive design build operate. So there's a whole host of things it can be. But essentially you bring in a contractor early on under a two-stage process. The first stage is called the preliminary services or the pre-development, and the second is actually the project delivery. In the pre-development, what they're doing is they're doing the design work, and they're doing the cost estimating and the permitting work and all that kind of stuff that needs to be done. For your septic systems, you could very easily use a progressive, because I think in some of these instances, some communities may not know how much it even costs to put them onto the sewer line. So under this progressive, they could do this work if you at any of the junctures, say the basis of design report, 30% design report, 60% design report, whatever it is, decide, look, this is $1 billion to get us, well, let's not do this, let's do something different. You can pull the plug. It's called an off-ramp, so you don't have to do that. You don't pay anything unless you pull the plug, and generally you don't pay anything until they've actually done the infrastructure, right? So it's a way to align the design work and the construction cost estimating with the actual deliverer of this work, but gives you little control over that process. It's very iterative. I probably didn't describe that well. I have some awesome slides on a different deck that I could have described it well. But if anyone's interested, I'm happy to follow up with that. But I do think just the challenge of coming in from the East Coast and doing this is I knew literally nothing, or maybe one or two things when I came in, but even over the course of 3 days, just listening to you guys, I'm getting more educated on the specifics of your problem, and so more ideas, more neurons are starting to fire. But, and I had to get the presentation done before then. So there is also the purely private approach. So P3, let me just do my one thing. So if on the left-hand side is traditional delivery, the right-hand side is privatization, the middle is sort of the public-private partnerships. Think of it in this term. The left-hand side is traditional delivery. The middle is like marriage. Public-private partnership is the public entity marrying the private sector to deliver outcomes, right? The public sector does become a little bit more of a regulator and less of a doer, but it is a marriage, and you have to work collaboratively. On the right-hand side, with privatization, think of it as divorce, right? You are undoing yourself of the problem. You're basically selling it. You're getting rid of it. Doesn't mean you don't have some responsibilities, maybe regulatory or maybe alimony, right? So there could always be some sort of issue there. And then if we take the analogy to its like nauseous extreme, on the left-hand side, traditional delivery is like being a bachelor and you're dating around, but you're always broke, right? So it kind of works in that regard. But I think that, the purely private approach, in the United States, we have 150,000 water authorities. About 20% of them are private. So we do have a big history of this. I think we have thousands of private water utilities that are out there. They serve 73 million Americans. There are a lot of diverse models. Some are utility models. Some are so you have American Water, you've got lots of them buying smaller utilities so that they can find economies of scale, et cetera. But it works out there. The key to this is that people get very frightened of this sometimes. I don't know in this community if you would be, because you're all very smart and well-read people, but the economic and the regulatory aspects of it, right? You want to be able to hold them in check and not give them blank freedom to raise rates and those sorts of things. So there is that relationship, as I said, kind of like the alimony and and having to deal with the regulatory approach afterwards. But there is this possibility as well. You just create a new entity, have bidders bid on it, and then let them manage these water problems, taking it out of the city and out of the town. May not be the approach for you, but it is a very common one that's out there and one to think about. This does lead me to the next thing, and this is this enabling framework. So money is important. How you deliver it is important. But probably one of the things that I'm a little bit more quizzical about in your case is the institutional framework around this, right? So you have a sewer system, you have a wastewater treatment plant that is managed by or owned by the town. You've got increasingly connectivity with the county. There's a lot of overlap there, but in the United States we have 150,000 water utilities. It's a balkanized approach, right? I mean, it's like some of these serve towns of less than 300 people, right? And this is a big problem in America because this town is not talking to them. We've talked about watershed issues. You can't divide water in this way, but even other sectors, we don't have this problem. Other sectors, we have I think transportation, we have transportation networks. Yeah, we have a lot of small local DOTs, but we also have them integrating into a broader system. Same with energy transmission, right? Water is the only aspect where we don't have these sort of regionalized approaches or watershed approaches. If you talk to the Corps of Engineers, they'll tell you they do, but they don't. So what is the trend right now is that there's a move right now, very, very popular movement in California towards what they're calling the regionalization of water treatment, of water systems. And basically it means trying to merge some of these microorganisms together so that they can operate on a more watershed basis. Because what's happening north of you is going to affect you so what if you bring those things together? And this is the question I still have. Smaller utilities even your local town here, they just don't have the resources to be able to manage some of the problems that you guys are throwing their way, right? They will tell you, look, we are a government entity. They have conflicting budget requirements. They've got limited staff, et cetera. Surely they could create a new monster governmental entity. I don't think that would go over well here, but that would be in charge of that. But would there be some efficiency and economies of scale in trying to regionalize this approach? And that's usually done through a JPA, a Joint Powers Authority, right? Very, very common. We're doing it on a lot of very specific infrastructure projects for flood risk management, et cetera. But it is something, it's basically the consolidation of multiple tiny, small water authorities into a larger one so they can make more holistic decisions. And I think in your case, and again, excuse the ignorance of what I don't know, particularly once you're starting to integrate through your I&I and your sewer system, it's really hard to just say that's your responsibility and this is our responsibility. There's no clear delineation of that risk allocation. So therefore, you're going to have to at some point either do an MOU with them in terms of, for instance, the fatties, the fats and things like that that are coming out of restaurants and they're going into the sewer systems. You would theoretically have different regulations for those industrial users and the bigger users than you would for a family, right? What if those are coming out of Teton County and not Jackson? Should they not be controlling that? You need to have the same regulation or your wastewater treatment plant, whatever you put in, is not going to work. It will not work because you're going to be taking in inflow that you don't know what it is and there's no quality control. So those regulations, you have to design for the future in terms of what you're going to be attending to, and that it's going to have to account for every single person today and tomorrow that's going to be integrated into your sewer lines. And that requires a regionalized approach. It can't be done just here. This slide is really to see who has good eyesight and who doesn't. So this is just the regionalization process. These slides will be available. This is from California. They have literally written the textbooks on this. They are doing this on a daily basis. They have a guide to how to regionalize, like first, call the person across the street. Second, set up a meeting. It may be a little too dumbed down, but it's working. So I just put it up there just so that you guys don't have to reinvent the wheel if this is something that you want to start to socialize. I'd also note that in August of this year, the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council came out with a draft decision on preparing U.S. critical infrastructure for today's evolving water crisis. So one of the recommendations was the move towards regionalization. A little surprising to me, to be quite frank. It's a little counterintuitive. Every single person on that panel I know, and I think that they're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, is that it's just impossible at this tiny micro level to be able to manage some of these watershed issues, right? But it's something to look at even more broadly in terms of some of how funding, financing, all of these issues are addressed in this particular paper that you may want to look at. I'm on the record and in the press as being against a lot of the recommendations, but this one I'm all for, so I'm going to say this is a good one. And there are other framework issues as well, and I think these are things that I'll leave just sort of dangling there, but the legal framework around funding and financing, for instance, with SRF funding, often if you use design build or progressive design build or even a P3 model, you're not eligible for SRF. That's a policy issue at the state level, not local level, right? And so these are the sort of framework issues that need to be identified and addressed if that's the way you want to go. And there you're going to find a bunch of them, right? Those sorts of things. Governance, who's overseeing this in the future? Again, if you have a new utility, let's just say you do a public-private partnership, who's the regulator of this to make sure, is it, again, if you regionalize, is it DEQ? So it's just figuring this out on sort of a local basis is going to be important. Probably the most complex thing for you right now is going to be how do you bundle the different recommendations in the master plan into the right projects to be able to take those to reality. And again, I'm struggling internally with sort of the need to know what's going to come onto the sewer lines because what's going to be treated by the wastewater treatment plant if you do a new wastewater treatment plant versus just going ahead and like doing some pilot projects for the septic, So figuring that out is going to be really important. And of course, as everyone has already mentioned today, public buy-in. You guys do a really good job. I watched maybe 50% of your public meetings, and just to get a little familiar with your problems, and they're really well managed, so kudos to you on that. But as you go, continually educating people. As I said, most people don't know what is going on in their backyard in terms of infrastructure. So the final thoughts, just to conclude, I also have a heater in front of me, so I'm just going as long as I can. So it's not that I have much to say, I'm just really warm for the first time all day. Some final thoughts. There is a huge cost to doing nothing, a huge cost to doing nothing. Time is not your ally when it comes to infrastructure. Deferring decisions. I know you have to make a good decision, a right decision, but putting off hard decisions forever is just going to increase the cost, complicate the heck out of the current situation, and it's just going to get more expensive. It's not going to help you. It's going to hinder you. To deliver the necessary benefits, you need to figure out now how to determine how to execute the projects. This is all really complex stuff to those of you who don't do it, maybe. This is really basic stuff in my world. You can get people to help you with this, right? It's not that complex, but you need to think about it. You can't put this off and say, all right, now we've got the master plan, what do we do? As you're finalizing the master plan and you're looking at those recommendations, you should be saying, well, we could do that if we use the CBP3 approach, but if we went to P3, or maybe we need to talk about regionalization before we do, but you can come up with a plan as you're doing that, and that should also help you prioritize and sort of figure out your way forward. Again, there's a million ways of doing it. There's an infinite number of funding, financing, and delivery options. There's no one right answer. It's going to be what is right for you as a community. But I think that once you get more familiarized with these sorts of concepts, you're going to be able to find one that works. Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, and that's what you will get if you do nothing. Status quo right now with our changing water conditions, with our changing infrastructure world, today, if you are to build something and not incorporate smart technology, I mean, this is one of my big issues with Washington right now. So the Build Back Better had very few provisions for the use of smart technology. The Internet of Things, we can put into a levee that we forget about in 100 years, sensors that will tell us before that levee breaks or where there's stress. There are now pavements that regenerate themselves. We can avoid O&M costs, right? I'm working with Purdue University. It's amazing what they're doing in the infrastructure space. So also, as you go forward to build these new things, think about that, right? Let's do this now and not have to do it again in 15 years. It's a lot of meetings, right, if you have to do this again in 15 years. So do it right the first time. Future-proof your solutions. Put the provisions. Maybe today you don't know if you want to have recycled water in the future. You can build something that just has a little outpost right there to connect in the future, right? But you want to future-proof for those sorts of things. And be bold. I mean, create your own paradigm. I've given you a lot of examples, but every day we're coming up with new contracting, new structures for this. Maybe there is going to be the Jackson Hole approach to water quality, and it'll be something that'll be some combination of all of these. But nothing is impossible. We do really complicated things all the time and get them done, but you have to act. It's not something that will happen organically. It's something that has to be pushed forward. So on that, now that my feet are sweating, finally, I will pause there. I don't know if there's time for questions. I did go a bit long, so I apologize.
I know it didn't, oh, there, I can tell. So I'm a chemical engineer, and my history is, building new chemical plants, and some of them were wastewater treatment plants, but industrial. So one of the first steps that I am so happy that the county or city did is that they said they're going to hire a water quality specialist. To me, that seems so critical because we don't necessarily have the experience in the county to do that type of infrastructure. So I'm hoping when I'm communicating to the decision makers is the critical importance of that person's experience in doing infrastructure. So I'm probably advocating for an engineer that, whether they're an environmental engineer or chemical engineer, that has actually executed these types of projects. I'm certainly concerned that 150,000 as a salary is not it, or is not going to cover it. So I'm wondering if you can comment on, knowing what you know, what type of qualifications this county needs in order to really, what I see, take the first steps. Because I think that we don't have an accurate timeline and all the executable steps that have to happen at the same time to even get to a design, and understanding that, and even to look at funding and how much it's going to cost, we're going to have to spend maybe 500,000 that is going to get to a 90% design. So I mean, I think that's a conversation that needs to happen. And you can help.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's a good question. So it depends is the worst answer ever, but it does. In terms of what you are doing in-house and what you are going to contract out, right? So if you have an engineer in-house who is designing the water quality standards, or you're going to hire one, they don't necessarily have to be an engineer on the other side of that. They can define the output requirements, and then you can have somebody bid to that. But you do need somebody within the organization, the public sector, who can be a counterpart to the design builder, right? So you can bring in a private design builder to do that, but you're going to want to review their designs, et cetera, right? So if you're taking on a regulatory structure, right, and you're looking at these sorts of things, that's one characteristic. If you are going to do design bid build as the town, then you need more staff internally, because you're going to be literally reviewing those designs on a daily basis after you procure a designer, right? So this is what I mean by institutional structuring. If you're regulating and there's less government, then you need fewer people, but they need to be specialized in overseeing contract management, those sorts of things. If you're doing, then you need bigger workforce that's actually in charge of sort of overseeing construction supervision, all that kind of stuff. You may even have, so you'll need a bigger staff. And this is what you need to decide, right, is how are we going to deliver this? And then you're going to know institutionally, what do we need internally to be able to be a competent counterpart? That's that governance structure I was talking about. Who is on the other side? If you hire a private designer or design builder, who's on the other side of that? Because you can't just say, you do it and then we'll have a public meeting on it, right? That's a daily task that you're back and forth on. And so you would need at least two staff, at least two, that would be overseeing the design work. Probably you'd get an owner's rep. You'd hire somebody as an owner's rep who basically are defending the city's, the town's interests against that design builder. So it's a lot of consultants on both sides of it, but that's a very standard model that we see. So the answer is I don't know, because it depends on what you guys are going to be doing in-house versus the other. But I would say whatever, you're probably going to need an owner's rep, because you're going to need somebody who's actually overseen the design and construction of these sorts of things. And even if they're not doing it, they'll know where to look. So as an example, I flew in from Portland because we're doing a progressive design, build, finance, operate, maintain for a new wastewater treatment plant. It's using aqua narrata, so they're reducing it's a new anaerobic something granule, but they've reduced the size of the footprint from like 14 acres down to 2 acres, tiny little thing now for the Portland and City of Lake Oswego are doing it. It's a progressive design build, which means that they hired a company who's going to design, build, finance, operate, maintain this thing. But they, on the city side, which I'm on the city side, so I'm their owner's rep together with an engineering firm and a legal firm. So we put together the contract documents, we did all of that kind of stuff. And we're kind of just holding the contractor that has been hired to account, right? So no, this is what the contract said, you need to do this. Here are the DEQ standards that we're requiring. Why is your ammonia level like 0.10 whatever over this? What are you going to do about screens, these sorts of things? You need to have the owner's rep no matter what your sort of structure is going to be. But I'd be happy to send you more stuff on that. Again, it's pretty standard public works stuff. I just don't know what your local town and county have in-house that would be doing that. Often we find in smaller jurisdictions, the same guy who's doing the maintenance facility will also be doing the water system, they'll also be doing the highway. And they won't be able to push back on quality control issues because they don't know them, right? I mean, they're very specialized. So that's where they really need to get help from a third party.